Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with yet another edition of our weekly review of international affairs that is curated for the needs of aspirants of civil service examinations, and I think it will add to your understanding of events in different continents and countries that have a bearing on international politics and more on India's national interest. We also hope that you can view them as a lay viewer with great interest and add to your understanding of world politics and international relations. A most unexpected and dramatic joint statement was made last week by Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of UAE, who is the effective ruler there, that the two countries are going to normalize their relations. Now, this word normalization is a bit of a euphemism, understatement, because what this joint statement published before the world was a scheme which is apparently redrawing the geopolitical map of Middle East and is bound to have far-reaching consequences for international relations, not only in Middle East but elsewhere also. This is almost the forging of an alliance where the two hitherto perceived as enemy countries are going to cooperate in future in a diversity of fields. The immediate priority, of course, is to share the discovery and vaccination of a COVID vaccine. But then this area of cooperation is really vast. It is going to cover energy, tourism, infrastructure, higher education, research, and sharing, obviously, of intelligence information of mutual interest to each other. Now, how do we look at it? First of all, dramatic the announcement has been. Unexpected it has been, but now suddenly, with the advantage of hindsight, analysts are saying that the process was on for quite some time and this affair has been kept under cover by both parties. The deal has been brokered, as President Trump claims, by him. This is, of course, one of his electoral flashes in the campaign, that he would say that this is his great diplomatic victory of bringing the two warring factions in Middle East together. But come to think of it, this process has roots in the Camp David long years ago, when Egypt, the most significant, most substantial enemy perceived by the Israelis, made an agreement in 1979 to live in peace with Israel. Jordan followed after a decade and a half, and that's where things have stood. But in recent past, there have been lots of events which have made the UAE and their immediate neighbors, Oman and Muscat, the other smaller countries in this region, Bahrain and Qatar, a little apprehensive about what is happening. First of all, there is this confrontation with Shia Iran. Iran has steadily drawn towards China, and Iran is targeting all the Sunnis, including the Saudi Arabs, who are the custodians of the holy places. Their oil refineries have been targeted and attacked, and the Saudis themselves, though they have kept silent about this agreement at the moment, would not be very unhappy, because I think they had been disappointed by the US not coming out openly against Iran in their support when this thing happened. We also have been seeing some kind of a fraternal rivalry between UAE and Saudi Arab, either in Yemen or elsewhere, where the two have not been exactly on the same wavelength or the same page, as they say. But what has happened is, what this agreement leads to, let's analyze it bit by bit, piece by piece, point by point. The Israelis agree. The Israeli Prime Minister has given a commitment that he will not demolish the Palestinian land houses built by the Israeli refugees. It's quite ironical to call them Israeli refugees, because they have been settled with governmental consent on the land supposedly under the control of Palestinian Authority. So, is it a good sign or is it a bad sign? The Palestinians are fuming with rage, because they say that this agreement, this compromise, this concession is no concession at all, because it also legitimizes the Israeli control, de jure and de facto, over the whole territory which was supposed to become one day, in distant future, if not immediately, a part of the Palestinian state. So they are obviously unhappy. Israelis probably have taken advantage of the happenings recently in Lebanon, where the Hezbollah is under pressure, because it was part of the structure which supported a very corrupt regime, which has led to the explosion, which has almost destroyed the country's functionality. It is almost a failed state. And then the government refuses to go. It has practically handed over all powers to military, and a harsh crackdown on the protesters has been ordered. So probably Israelis thought that this was the right time to take advantage and get rid of a discredited, slightly enfeebled Hamas in the Palestinian territory, which is an Islamic terrorist group recognized by the Western world and the United States of America, and also Hezbollah at one go. So they would probably make advances in territory which was so far not open to them. Now also let's look at this, that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia has had a very close relationship with President Trump's son-in-law Kushner, but he also probably is preparing for the day when Trump might not be in White House and other options should be explored and kept open. And he of course likes to project his image as a modernizer, as a person who's bringing out change in his country. So although Saudi Arab has not either complimented or criticized this agreement, they probably would not be unhappy about the consolidation of the Sunni Muslim states against the only Shia powerful state in this region, Iran, and Iran having drawn closer to China, again is a greater threat for the American and the Western interest. The second thing which I think should be kept in mind is that the Turkey's aggressive expansion, which we shall talk about it at length in another segment, has been causing concern to other Muslim states in this region, because Turkey is trying to become more expansionist. It's trying to eye the oil and gas resources from the northwestern tip of Africa to Middle East to Eastern Mediterranean and to Cyprus and Greece, and it has also been drawing greatly towards dogmatic fundamental Islamization. So whether it is conversion of a museum into, which was earlier a church, to a mosque again, or it is becoming more and more Islamic in the governance. The problem is that there can't be too many Muslim countries with military power, with economic resource base, who vie for leadership in this region. So both Saudi Arab and UAE can have a modest advantage to share power, but they can't look forward to sharing power with the erstwhile NATO ally of America. It continues to be a member of NATO, but Turkey in recent past has been behaving in a manner that it doesn't care anymore about the NATO alliance or the interests of the Western countries. So this is the broad context of this agreement. Now interestingly, the criticism which has come from countries as far off as Malaysia, where the government has not come out with a statement, but the ex-Prime Minister, 95-year-old Dr. Mahathir, who's always very aggressive, who's always very pro-Islamic, he has said that this is an aggression against the Muslim states. It is an effort to divide Muslim states. Although in Indonesia, the government has not come out in criticism of this agreement, Nahdlatul Islam Party, which claims the allegiance of 40% of the population in Indonesia and 90% of the population of Indonesia is Muslim. So they claim to represent Muslims in a large number, and they said that this again is a divisive policy which is going to divide the Islamic nations. Now obviously neither Malaysia nor the tiny Sultanate of Brunei nor Indonesia, which is large and capable, are in a position to influence developments in the Middle East and do anything about it. They again are worried about China's downward thrust in South China Sea. They are worried about growing Islamization and jihadi nature of terrorist groups active in their territories, some sleeping cells, some active from time to time. So this is going to be an extremely interesting situation for Indian foreign policy formulators. Indians have had very close relationship with UAE, and it has improved its relationship with Saudi Arab, very much so since Narendra Modi became the Prime Minister and cultivated these two countries. It has had traditionally very good relationship with Oman and Muscat as well. Now, India had a good traditional relationship with Iran, but if Iran chooses to throw its lots with China and Pakistan, then I'm afraid Indians cannot keep harking back to traditional historical cultural ties, and they have to look elsewhere. The Indians have to worry about what Pakistan is going to do, what Pakistan's Islamic nation is. And I think the advantageous position for India in this context is Pakistan has in recent past burnt its bridges with Saudi Arab. Saudi Arab has asked Pakistan to repay a $3 billion loan immediately. It has also cancelled a $3.5 billion aid program which it had promised, because Pakistanis said that if the Saudis don't do what they want them to do, criticize India about Kashmir, call a meeting of the Islamic countries in support of Pakistan, lend them support in the United Nations, Pakistan would have to think about forming another organization of Muslim states. So Saudi Arabs definitely are not going to like this from a from a state which is totally, if not totally, more than partially dependent on aid from them. So probably for India there is a opportunity here without taking sides. Indians have been close to Palestinians, but Palestinians unfortunately are not the kind of an actor in real political terms that can make a difference to India's furtherance of its own national interests. We again have to worry about the aggressive nature of Turkey, Islamization, because Turkey again puts pressure on Kurds in North Iraq, Kurds in Syria, in the northern part of its own country, and this raises issues of self-determination, human rights violations, crimes against humanity, which are sensitive issues. So Indians cannot either put Turkey in a dock or adopt a very defensive manner about these things. So we have to see that this mix which is emerging after the Israel United Arab Emirate agreement is a very, very volatile, explosive mix. So we'll have to be very careful, be very balanced, and think strictly in terms of our own interests. Turkey is the elephant in the room that no one seems to be willing to talk about these days. In the last week, Turkey carried on with its aggressive, expansive diplomacy and military deployment, which can turn explosive any moment. We have talked in past about Turkey's involvement in Libya, the Libyan civil war. We have talked about Turkey's interventions in northern Iraq, supposedly to quell the Kurdish targeting Turkish territories and interests. But I think what is happening is this: Turkey is playing for very high stakes. Turkey under Erdogan has never left anybody in any doubt that it wants to reclaim the leadership of the Islamic world and play a decisive role in the politics of Middle East. It is indeed an inheritor to the legacy of the great Constantinople Byzantine Empire, but those days are gone. And I think the caliphate today, the Islamic caliphate, may seek inspiration from the old caliphate, but it is difficult to imagine that something of that kind can restore Turkey to its old glorious role in international politics. But that is not going to stop Turkey from pursuing these aims. The latest has been building up tension with two small neighbors, Cyprus and Greece, about resources of gas which lie under the surface of water. Now this is interesting. This is supposed to be the largest reserve of natural gas in the world under water, and it is estimated that it is about 3 trillion cubic meters, and which means that it can sustain the energy needs of United States of America that are considerable for a 10-year long period. Now the problem arises because when we say the gas lies under the surface of water, what do we mean by it? In international law, there are two concepts. The one is the concept of territorial waters, which extends from the mainland mass to 12 nautical miles towards the seas. And then there is something called exclusive economic zone, which extends 200 kilometers to the high seas. Now the problem arises and the dispute originates in how do you calculate these distances? Like China, Turkey refuses to accept the norms and conventions of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Laws of Seas, and it doesn't agree that it should be measured from the islands under the sovereign control of a nation state. It insists that it should be measured from the continental shelf. Now the concept of continental shelf is interesting. Continental shelf is the landmass which is submerged under water and slowly, gradually drops in its incline and height and then drops suddenly to deep sea. So till that point the continental shelf is supposed to be under the control of a country to whose landmass this is attached. Turkey insists that the EEZ should be measured from the continental shelf, not from the islands which a country controls. The problem is that the moment you bring in this concept, the continental shelf of Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, and curiously of Libya sort of come into overlapping each other, and this is a dispute. Turkey has gone ahead, started drilling for disputed, not only in disputed land but also on high seas, which others think is interfering with their passage on high seas, and I don't think that Turkey has any right to do so. The French tried to resist their naval might in Libya, but they had to back off. But wiser by that experience, the French President Macron has now made a statement that he is not going to back out. He is going to match force with equal force, and he has promised that he is going to have increased deployment of naval presence, French naval presence in Eastern Mediterranean. If this happens and the Americans send some naval force there, it is going to be an extremely explosive situation where a small spark can ignite something. Now, it is difficult to imagine that Turkey, which continues to be a member of NATO, has been throughout the Cold War an ally of the Western world, will suddenly take on these risks. But one never can tell, because Turkey, when it was a loyal partner in NATO, was not being ruled by Erdogan. The world was a different world. And I think the conflict between Turkey and Russia in the northwestern tip of Africa also has its basis on this politics of oil and gas, because at the moment Russia is the largest supplier of natural gas to Europe, and Europe's energy security depends on it. Europe is also looking forward to, if Cyprus and Greece manage to tap these gas resources and lay a pipeline, submarine pipeline, and reach Western Europe, the Western Europe would no longer be dependent on Russian gas coming through. But the Russians may not like this idea very much, but the Greece had already agreed into, and Cyprus, an agreement with other countries, like Egypt, to supply gas to them. But of course, Turkey says that they have no right to get into an agreement with this gas, which doesn't belong to them. And Turkey itself has done a deal with Libya where it could supply gas to them. Now, this cooperation between an Islamic Libya, where the Islamic jihadi elements are quite influential, and Turkey, which is itself veering towards more and more intolerant version of Islam, combining and controlling this gas, is definitely not going to be liked by the Western European, and they are not likely to remain silent witnesses to this. Now, the interesting part about Cyprus is that the Cyprus, unfortunately, after a most painful civil war, was partitioned. The southern Cyprus is Christian, the northern Cyprus is Muslim, and very poor, very badly ruled, never been able to recover. So they could claim that their oil and gas mostly would allow them to develop fast. But there's an argument for argument's sake. I think the same argument could be extended by Greece, same argument could be expanded by the southern Cyprus. Now, the problem is that this politics of gas is bound to impact on the fossil fuel reserves, oil and gas, which Emirate has, which Saudi Arab has. So this is going to be, in coming days, a very, very tricky position. Now, Russia is again not going to remain silent, because it is not only that the Turks and the Russians are facing each other in various theaters from Syria to Libya. It is also the question of gas. Ultimately, the Russians would not like the Turks to control this gas, which cuts their customer base. So this is interesting, and Turkey has been in the dock for a variety of other reasons, for targeting Kurds, not only in its own northern territories, but trying to chase them. It has threatened the government of Syria that look, we will come across. They have also said this to Iraqis, that we don't care if we have to protect our national interests. And both the regimes in Iraq and Syria are not in a position to stand up on their own to Turkish military might and aggression across their borders. So this challenges the Turkey's behavior pattern, challenges the concept of sovereign nationhood of Iraq, of Syria, and also gets into the volatile mix of Kurds' self-determination, Kurdistan, and the differences within the Kurds, PPK, Working Party, and the Nationalist Party. So there are so many issues here which Turkey seems to be playing with fire without thinking of consequences. And I think Indians will have to be careful responding to the developments in this area. The American presidential elections and the developments related to it are going to keep us engaged and immersed till November, and maybe a little after that also, if the likely signs are indicating. Two interesting developments related to American presidential elections took place last week. One of them was the suspense over the running mate of Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate. The suspense is now over. Biden has declared that his running mate would be Kamala Harris, a lady of partly Indian origin, who identifies as a black American. Her father was a Jamaican economist. Her mother was a Tamilian cancer scientist. Both belong to upper crust of the American educated elite. But she chose to go to a black university and has ever since identified as a black woman in her career. Now, obviously, Indians are extremely happy with this choice because, as is the habit of Indians, they take pride in the achievement of any Indian, a member belonging to Indian diaspora, though they might have cut their ties with India 2 generations back or even a generation back. This happens when Kalpana Chawla goes to space. This happens when a Nobel Prize is awarded to a scientist who for 4 or 5 decades, like Dr. Chandrasekhar has stayed in, or Dr. Ramachandran have stayed in either America or Britain. It happens when a person of Indian origin becomes, like Bobby Jindal, a governor of an American state, or a senator is there of an Indian origin, or a congresswoman. But I think we should get over this habit, because if there is a CEO like Indira Nooyi in Pepsi, Satya Nadella, or Sundar Pichai, or Mr. Banga, and we suddenly think that Indians have taken over the United States of America, and now we can decide their policies in our interest. I think we should get over this. So for us to imagine that we are partly black, partly Indian, it gives us an advantage of treading the middle ground and taking advantage of this is there. Kamala Harris has always been an aggressive, charismatic politician whose stance has not necessarily been favorable to Indian diplomacy and foreign policy. Now, obviously, the argument always is this, that a person changes from an electoral campaign, and when he or she assumes a power of significance, importance, and responsibility. The interesting part is that past experience shows that the Republicans' administration under them has always been a little more favorable, a little more resilient to Indians, while the Democrats have been more critical of human rights violations, about self-determination in Kashmir, and generally critical of our policies. But that apart, how will Kamala Harris's partnership benefit Biden? First of all, what happens is Trump has started accusing her, and is his habit. He has started challenging that. I'm not saying so, but I've been very reliably informed by a lawyer of great repute who is very well qualified that she is not an American citizen. Now, she is a natural born American citizen. Her parents were immigrants, but even a child of a immigrant parent who has become a naturalized citizen gets citizenship by birth, but in this case it is very much there. Now, she is more American than an Indian. So that's one part. She is more Democrat than many Republicans favorable to India. When there was this small confrontation between now the Indian foreign minister, he was then visiting America, and he was supposed to meet a delegation of American congresswomen and senators, and when he said that he would not meet a person called Pelosi because this congresswoman had been very critical in her hearings of Indians about Jammu and Kashmir, Kamala Harris had stood by her colleague and defended this position. So that's one part which we should not very easily forget. Then again, we should not forget that the American diaspora, the Indian diaspora in America, is also divided among those who support Republicans and those who support Democrats. This is going to be reflected in the elections. This is going to be reflected in policy making in America. Suddenly, the lobbyists who have been supporting Pakistan, etc., are not going to disappear, dissolve, etc., because Kamala Harris is now there. So I think there is need for caution. One could take reasonable pride, but she is not even a person who was studying in India. It was not like Indira Nooyi or Satya Nadella or Sundar Pichai, who did their education primarily in India and then went to America and then worked their way from bottom up there. So she is very much an American politician. That's one part. The other interesting news item is President Trump's attitude and statements about postal ballots. Now, ever since the coronavirus threat, there has been this discussion that the American citizen might not find it possible to physically go and cast their vote. So American system allows for postal ballots, and we have been told that 40% of Americans vote through these means for state elections, for local elections, for primaries, and for the presidential elections. Now, President Trump from the beginning has been saying that this is a fraud, this is a conspiracy of the ultra-left, the conspiracy of communists, thinly disguised terrorists who want to destroy American system, to take away the presidency from him. He is a custodian of American values, constitution, white supremacy, etc., etc. So he says that if the postal ballots are allowed, it would complicate things no end. The postal department might not be able to cope with it, ballots will not reach in time, and this fraud would, even if the fraud is not outright fraud, the counting would take so much time and there would be so much uncertainty even after the election day that nobody would know whether inauguration would take place or not, whether somebody would have been elected as President of America without any dispute with a majority of vote. Now the American presidential system has a variety of complications. There is a popular vote, there is an electoral college, and both in the case of Al Gore and in Hillary Clinton, it was clear that they had the majority of the popular vote, but they did not get the electoral college votes, and Trump won. There also have been accusations of deals being done, elections being stolen, and this time the charge and the allegation of foreign governments trying to interfere with American elections to either keep Trump in power or keep Trump out of power are evenly divided. The Russians continue to be accused of interfering in elections, so keep Trump in power, who's under their thumb. The Chinese would like, obviously, Trump out of power, so there is some concession in the trade war against China. Let's see what happens. Whether one can go back on the dismantling or the damage which Trump has done is another issue. But what is interesting is that Trump's most recent statement was, so far he had only been insinuating, he was doing innuendos about this. Right now he has made a statement that he is blocking a grant of $5 billion US, which would have made the United States Postal Service efficient. The United States Postal Service is already crippled because of COVID. They were planning to take away some mailboxes. Now they have come out with reassuring noises that till the elections they will not do so. They will try to work their best to make the postal ballot a success. But one doesn't even know how Trump will conduct himself constitutionally, extra-constitutionally, legally or illegally, and then of course the challenge would finally go to the courts, and the federal court would have a majority of judges which are appointees of Trump. So everybody is a bit worried what would happen to the democracy and rule of law in America if there is a failure of the postal ballot. And you know, the system is again very odd. Earlier it was that the postmark was treated as the day when the ballot was posted. But if it reaches disregarding the postmark after the counting has started, they are going to be discarded. So there is an element of uncertainty which has been introduced at this late stage. How it will unravel, we'll see in days to come. Events on the periphery of Russia have also attracted the attention of analysts of international relations. Belarus, a small country in Eastern Europe, adjacent to Russia, once its part, has been on the boil ever since President Lukashenko, who has ruled the country for 26 years, declared himself a winner once again in the presidential elections and claimed that he had won over 80% votes. Nobody believes him because this time there were such massive protests against his continuance in his country, especially in the capital Minsk, that people thought that Svetlana, a lady of great courage, an English teacher whose husband had been imprisoned, who originally was a presidential candidate, was rallying so much support that the opposition this time might be in a free and fair elections, would be able to unseat the dictator. But unfortunately, this did not happen to be a free and fair election. And what is worse, right after he won the election, the President Lukashenko also ordered a brutal crackdown on protesters who had come out on the streets of Minsk and other cities against the fraudulent taking away, stealing away of the elections. Interestingly, he had accused his one-time ally and partner Russia of interfering with the elections, but strange things have happened in Belarus since then. For a week running, there has been no letdown on the protests on the streets, despite of the crackdown. And there have been some very touching scenes. There was brutal repression, people were arrested, one man lost his life with a cracked skull on the roadside. The way the protesters were herded into jail vans was extremely chilling. But what happened is that the women, once again, taking the lead from Svetlana, who had left the country fearing for her own security and security of her children, but the women of Belarus came out on the streets. They were holding flowers in their hands, they were laughing, smiling, and the security forces did not know what to do with them. And most of the security people deployed were youngsters, and when these women approached them and invited them to join them and say, hey, you are one of us, why are you holding your guns and shields against us? There were scenes which were reminiscent of the Kent University demonstrations at the height of the Vietnam War. These women picked up their flowers, put in the shields, protective shields of these soldiers. Some of these soldiers removed their shields. There was crying, there was smiling, they were embracing. All these were signs that the President Lukashenko cannot take for granted the loyal support, at least of the younger elements in the security forces and the police. So far, he has managed to retain their loyalty by guaranteeing them privileges, secure wages, which have nullified to a large extent the inflation. But I think the rest of the population is also having an appeal to these security forces who are asking questions. What is worse, the United Nations Human Rights Commission has condemned Lukashenko's brutal repression very badly. European Union has threatened that they would impose fresh sanctions on the country. There were sanctions earlier imposed on Belarus, but some of them had been taken back in 2016. When everybody thought that Lukashenko, after having stabilized his regime, might become a little more open to freedom of expression and democratic forms of governance, or at least peaceful protests. This has not happened. Now, as if this was not enough, the immediate neighborhood in the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, once again a part of the Soviet Empire at one stage in past, have appealed to Belarus to order free and fair elections immediately. Poland has joined this demand. What is worse, poor Lukashenko, although it is difficult to sympathize with him, has been forced to beg for help from his estranged friend Putin. Now, this allows Putin a wonderful opportunity to reassert his claim on Belarus, and whatever else happens, the position of Lukashenko has weakened considerably. There were strikes by factory workers. Lukashenko appealed to them that they should not strike, because if they strike, the economy would tumble down even further. There would be more destabilization. And his chant has been that there is no domestic protest against his rule. It is only a foreign conspiracy. It is the Western countries. It falls into the broader pattern of colored revolutions of Georgia, Ukraine, etc., on which point there is an agreement between him and Putin's Russia. But Putin has always been arguing that Belarus should reunite with Russia. Now, Lukashenko begging for help from Putin to save him in this time of trouble. Putin is of course reassured that he has talked to various people, and they have agreed, the two leaders, Lukashenko and Putin, that soon a peaceful solution would be found of this problem. But it would be, for people of Belarus, it might be like from frying pan to fire. So if either Russian influence increases in Belarus, or sooner or later Belarus is annexed or rejoins Mother Russia, what happens to the democratic aspirations or change? Because the country would remain divided. Now, Putin also has been facing an increasing number of these demonstrations in Moscow and other cities, even in far off Siberia. So there he knows best how to handle these protests in a single party government. And having a careful blend of peaceful negotiations and repression, but that is besides the point. What is interesting is that also in the neighborhood, Azerbaijan and Armenia have been having trouble. And Turkey, which is allies to Azerbaijan, after a few military skirmishes on the border, has tried to promise to come to the support of Azerbaijan against Armenians if this happens. Now, this disturbed situation also allows Putin to convey to its one-time satellites that, look, alone they cannot survive. If they have the protection of Russia, they are in a far better position. On the other extremity, on the eastern periphery of Russia, there were interesting developments pertaining to Mongolia. The vice foreign minister of Russia was visiting Ulaanbaatar, and he once again renewed his invitation to the Mongolians to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, this is an organization which is supposed to be a countervailing influence against the United States and Western influence in global politics. At one stage, it thought that it would bring together Russia and China, which may or may not happen. Lots of countries have tried to join this either as an observer or as a special invitee, or kept waiting for membership to be granted to them. But this is besides the point. Mongolians so far have been trying to very delicately balance the American influence, the Russian influence, and the Chinese influence. They are a large landmass, a thinly populated country. Their memories date back to Genghis Khan, who was a great conqueror at one stage and is supposed to be half a line that contributed to the bloodline of the Mughals which came to India. So there is a bit of an Islamic connection, there is a bit of a nomadic connection, there is a bit of a landlocked country being tempted, if it has a corridor which is the China, Mongolia, Russia economic corridor, it would allow it access to the seas. It would break the imprisonment of a landlocked country. But would it be worth its while? Would it make it remain a reasonable independent country if it joins any of these alliances? All three countries, US is not an immediate neighbor, but it is sandwiched between Russia and China, so it cannot really push back against both of them if they are collaborating. But this again, the Mongolian connection, from quite some time, Mongolia has been an independent country. So the Russian strategic design seems to be, at the moment, convince its erstwhile satellites that it is in their interest to join back Mother Russia, maybe slowly but steadily. This is something which I think Putin is working on very, very carefully. Last week, the United States of America was confronted with a diplomatic fiasco at the United Nations. When the United States introduced a motion to extend the embargo against Iran, it met with a miserable failure. Only two countries, United States itself and Dominican Republic, came out openly in support. United States of America's allies, Britain, Germany, France, abstained. China and Russia strongly criticized it. Now the Americans were half expecting that this motion would not have an easy passage in Security Council. It would ultimately meet with a veto by the Chinese or the Russian. But it had not realized that it had absolutely no support in this important body, and the failure would be so dismal. Now, President Trump has immediately said that he is going to use the snapback provision of the Iran-US nuclear deal to reimpose these sanctions against Iran. But it is an ironical situation because Trump has himself discarded the accord. So if the accord is no longer in force, how can it be invoked to have a snapback section? So this is something which is going to cause more than a little embarrassment for the Americans. The problem is not only confined to diplomatic resistance or diplomatic opposition to American unilateralism in United Nations. There are signs that the tensions between Iran and the United States of America are increasing. Striking range, they have small gunboats, but they have put up models of American aircraft carriers and surrounded them with their smaller but very lethal boats, trying to convey the signal to Americans that they should not underestimate the lethal retaliatory capacity which the Iran has at its command. Now, Iran has a variety of weapons which it can use without all the time talking about the nuclear option and so on, and Iran, having protected its other front with an alliance with China, probably is a greater strategic threat even in these exercises. United States, it seems, has not only made itself unpopular by diplomatic unilateralism, it probably has also overstretched itself. The American naval forces are showing the flag in South China Sea, where again the American planes are flying very close to the Chinese airspace, and all these are considered by Chinese as provocative actions. So there is a chance of an accidental flare-up. Hopefully it will be contained, but both in South China Sea and in the Gulf of Hormuz, whether it's a confrontation with Iran or China, or the cooperation between China and Iran diplomatically and strategically, is going to be increasing difficulties for United States of America. Things on the continent of Africa seem to be getting worse from bad. Normally it is said that no news is good news, but if you get no news from Africa, it means that something is brewing which will explode suddenly and disturb all the calculations which various actors in international politics make about Africa. Now, the principal thing which we must understand is that we talk of Africa as a continent, but Africa doesn't have a homogeneous identity. It is divided in different strips. It is divided between the Maghreb, the southern part, the eastern coast, the western coast, the heart of Africa, and each country located in a particular sub-region has compulsions of its own, problems of its own. Last week, what caused concern? Normally we have been concentrating on the northwestern tip of Africa and the civil war in Libya, but a little under that, Ivory Coast and Equatorial Guinea suddenly got into the news, and both for different reasons. Ivory Coast for long has been considered an oasis of peace in this disturbed region, where there was economic stability, where there was a popular president, but unfortunately the president is bordering on 80 plus, and he had earlier declared that he would not contest the elections for the third time, although the constitution had been amended to allow under exceptional circumstances for a president to continue on the third term or even a fourth term. But he had nominated his successor, who was popular, who had been trained by him, who was a loyal lieutenant for years, and people thought that there would be a peaceful transition in this country. Unfortunately, this was not to be. This chosen successor died of a heart attack, and the president was left with no option but to say that he was going to recontest elections. This has triggered a series of protests, and people are protesting against inflation. People are reminded of the days of the civil war. People are worried about repression which might follow. People are worried about stifling of the voice of the opposition. Now, Equatorial Guinea is even worse. The president there has not dismissed but secured the resignation of his prime minister, and the charges are that the prime minister and his government, which had been in power for 5 years, have failed to deliver economic development or to protect the country from law and order challenges or COVID virus, and the president takes over, and the president is preparing the ground, it seems, for his successor, this time his son. And now his son has been accused of massive corruptions amounting to billions of dollars in France, and is being convicted in absentia. He is being investigated for his ill-begotten wealth elsewhere in Switzerland and Sweden, where he has a large pile of luxury cars and so on. So this again seems to be another country heading towards dynastic succession, corruption, suppression of opposition. In Mozambique, a port of strategic significance was taken over by Islamic jihadis, which should cause concern, because if positions of strategic importance are allowed to fall by governments who claim to be de jure and de facto governments, they are not de facto governments anymore. So it vacates space for Islamic rebels, insurgents to come and create further trouble. So the communal dimension, the Islamic terror, is a very great threat in very many countries in Africa, and the so-called legitimate governments have almost yielded ground to them. Similarly, in Angola, there has been cases filed against the former presidents, and these are pointless diversions for governments which has failed to deliver on economic or social front to persecute either opponents or predecessors, or see to it that no successor emerges. So you have this problem, and again the news in Niger, where the French aid workers were killed along with their Nigerian guide near a wildlife reserve, has created trouble, and Macron, the French president, has declared his resolve to increase his presence in Africa and cope with this crisis in Sahel region. Now this is something again and not a very reassuring development. An erstwhile colonial power trying to restore law and order and peace, or UN forces supported by an earlier erstwhile colonial power trying to control the tide of Islamic Jihad, is again reminiscent of a return of colonialism to a continent which has suffered much because of it in an earlier phase. It is no longer possible to deny the reality. The painful reality is that the world is in the grip of an economic recession. The worst affected are the nations, the developed nations, the affluent nations in the Western world. The United States economy shrank by almost 20% in the second quarter of the year, and the second successive shrinking of the economy meant that US is in a recession which is unprecedented, which is as bad as the great crash of the first quarter of the 20th century. The economies of Europe have shrunk between 10 to 12%. France, Germany and United Kingdom, Spain and Portugal have registered a shrinking of 15%. So the Western Europe, the European Union is in the grips of recession. United States is in a grip of recession. Now the world had for a long time thought that this would hit China as well, the coronavirus and the trade war, and there were many American experts who thought that the sanctions imposed against China would unravel its economy. It depended on exports, it depended on foreign markets, it depended on various things, it depended on intellectual piracy. Now it is quite true that between 1995 and present day, in a 25-year period, the Chinese share has grown from 2%, 3% of the international trade to almost 16%. What is important is that China, in the meantime, in the recent years, past 3, 4, 5 years since Xi made his drive to power, supreme power, has tried to reduce its dependence on international trade. The trade, Chinese trade with most countries is imbalanced against them and in China's favor. So China is the second largest economy and it has a large market, and China probably has the capacity to sustain this war of attrition for which Xi has been preparing China. So as we see the statistics, the whole world is into the recession practically, and the Chinese claim that their economy has shrunk. They are having difficulties, but they are having difficulties also because of coronavirus, because of floods and so on, certainly because of the trade war with the United States of America, and countries like India imposing sanctions against them, countries like Australia creating obstacles for them. But their economy, they claim, has grown by 3% in the last quarter. American companies are downhill, but their business continues to be massively in the Chinese market. So what will happen if the Chinese economy shrinks further or the American companies move out of China is a matter of speculation. But it is going to hurt the Americans more than the Chinese, it is quite clear. Some people dispute that the Chinese statistics are manipulated, the Chinese economy is not doing so well. But what people fail to see, and which has been perceptibly observed by the conservative weekly economist from Britain, that the Chinese seem to have refined a very interesting model of state capitalism, where a major part of the work is done by sluggish public sector companies, and some private sector companies are allowed to enrich themselves, be flamboyant, take risks like Alibaba and co, and try to capture as much of a share of the international market. Now, these companies, which are supposedly private sector companies, also have close ties with the Communist Party and the Chinese government. They do realize that their freedom in free trade or free market is limited. Now, if the Chinese concentrate on this, and they concentrate in areas of technology, which is artificial intelligence, telecom, pharmaceuticals, the rest of the world's dependence on China is much more. So I think rather than gloat over the Chinese discomfiture, their manipulated figures, the world do well to consider that the Chinese model of state capitalism, where the state provides predictable, credible legal system, provides proper law and order, and the Chinese now claim that they are giving priority to environment, priority to healthcare, priority to artificial intelligence, and the self-reliance. Now, the Chinese may not be able to be compensate for the loss of international markets, but in Chinese calculation, the loss of international markets is not going to be for long. Maybe with change of the presidency in United States of America, some of the sanctions will go. Some of the European countries would probably get back to the Chinese telecom equipment, and probably the Chinese would emerge out of this recession stronger than before, or at least stronger than anyone else in the world. That is all we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. We will be back again next week. Till then, goodbye.